All right, hello once again, Jeff Scott of Rankin Technical College, coming at you with a series of video presentations for the Rankin Technical College AWD Application and Web Development 1111 .NET Framework with Web Databases class. All right, we're going to be going over the ASP.NET MVC with Entity Framework and CSS text by Lee Naylor. The book is filled with tons of good code. I wish that they did a little better example, sometimes at least, of explaining the things. So I've decided to take kind of another direction and first go over several of the chapters of John Galloway of Microsoft and others' professional ASP.NET MVC 5. So that's where I am, and I'm in Chapter 4, and in particular, I'm about halfway into it. So I'm on page 92, under the Executing the Scaffolded Code. It says, before you start the application running, let's address a burning question. What database does the Music Store DB use? You haven't created a database for the application to use or even specified a database connection. So the author says here, in fact, before I do this, I should go back and look over here. And I just want to make sure there's identity and there's an employee. So I do not have an MVC database. I've worked on this when I did the other section, and I want to make sure if I did have an MVC database that I removed it. So the code first approach attempts to use convention over configuration. Remember, that is one of the hallmarks of Model View Controller. If you don't configure specific mappings from your models to databases, tables, and columns, the Entity Framework uses conventions to create a schema for you. If you don't configure a specific connection, the Entity Framework creates one using a convention. All right. Explicitly configuring a convention is as easy as adding a connection string to the web.config file. By convention, the Entity Framework will look for a connection string with a name matching the name of the data context class. This allows you to control the context database connection in two ways. First, you can modify the connection string in web.config. Second, you can override the database name Entity Framework will use for a given DB context by altering the name argument passed into the constructor. Without a specific connection configured, the Entity Framework will try to connect to a local database, local DB, instance of SQL Server. So whatever is on your local machine, and find a database with the same name as the DB context derived class. If it can connect but doesn't find a database, it'll create it. If you run the application after the scaffolding completes and you navigate to the Store Manager URL, you'll discover that the Entity Framework has created a database named mvcmusicstore.models.musicstoredb in local DB. Then if you look at the Entity Framework model diagram, that's what will be shown. It'll have our album table, our genre table, and our artist table. In addition, it has a system table that starts with an underscore, and it's underscore migration history. As it says, the framework has figured out for each one of the tables, since it's called album, album ID, since it's called genre, genre ID, since it's called artist, artist ID. So it's figured out all of the primary keys. It's figured out the foreign keys, so it's got the relationship. It even understands the navigation properties. That migration history table that you see on screen here, and it's also on the on page 93. It says the Entity Framework uses this table to track the state of your code first models, so it can keep your code first models and your database schema in sync with one another. All right, let's just leave it right there. I think that should be sufficient for now. There's more reading if you're interested. Hey, go for it. All right, middle of page 94. An easy way to keep the database in sync with changes to your model is to allow the EF to recreate an existing database. You can tell the entity framework or EF to recreate it every time the app starts, or you can tell it to recreate it only when it detects a change in the model. You choose one of these two strategies by calling the static setInitializer method in the entity framework's database class. As it says, when you call the setInitializer, you need to pass in an iDatabaseInitializer object. All right. Two of them are provided with the framework. Drop create database always and drop create database if model changes. Now hopefully those make sense. This says every time you run the program, recreate. This says only recreate it if something has changed. And they give you an example here. It says, say you wanted to recreate it every time the application starts fresh. All right, then you do the drop database always. Page 95, you may be wondering why anyone would want to create a database from scratch every time the app starts. Even when the model changes, don't you want to preserve the data inside? The questions are valid, and you have to remember what features in the code-first approach facilitate the iterative and fast-changing phases. Before you push your site live and take real customer data, you'll want to use migrations to keep the code-first models and the associated database in sync. So this right here, migrations allow you to preserve existing data in the database as you build and refine your model definitions. All right. In the initial phase, you might want to have a new database populated with some initial records. You can do this by using what's called seeding the database. This is the middle of page 95. For the MVC Music Store app, you want to start development by recreating the database every time the app restarts. However, you want the new database to have a couple of genres, artists, and even an album available, so some initial data. In this case, you can derive a class from the drop create database always class and override the seed method. The seed method, as it says, enables you to create some initial data for the application. To see this in action, create a new class in the models folder called Music Store DB Initializer. Go into our models folder, right mouse click, add class, Music Store DB Initializer, add that class. All right. And it says we are to insert the seed method, which is shown. So rather than me typing all that in, I'll probably make a mistake anyway. I'm just going to grab all of this, copy it to the clipboard. In fact, I need more than that. Need every bit of this, I believe. Copy. And remember what seed data is. For lack of better words, that is what it is. All right? And what I'm telling you is it needs, seed data says, literally, we want a seed. We want some beginning data to be put in our database. It's going to be kind of hard to use a lot of this stuff without beginning data. So let's see. Oh, I guess we don't want this. Fix that, and now we've got one too many here. I believe that's now correct. All right. Calling into the base class implementation of the seed method saves the new objects into the database. We'll now have two genres. Okay, genre add jazz, genre add rock. We'll have two artists. All right, we will have two artists, and they will be Al Di Meola and Rush. All right. and we will have a single album entered into the music store rather, every time we regenerate the database. It says for this to work, we need to go into our application startup code to register this initializer. So that is in this file down here, global ASAX. We need to bring that file up, and under our application start, which is right here, we need to add at the very beginning, so add it right there, database dot set initializer new Alright, now it doesn't look like it likes this right now, but that's okay, we'll work on it. Let's give it a second here, and we need paren here, I believe. Alright, so let's look. It says it doesn't exist in the current context. We want to add a using statement. There that is. So database.setInitializer, new music store DB initializer. Well, it's giving me an error message, so I'm going to pause and see if I can track this error down. Alright, to get this to work, I had to make two changes from what I had typed in originally. The first is I had to add this using statement, and I had here DB initializer with a big D and a big B, where it was a big D and a little b. Alright, so it says if we restart the application now, which is what I'm going to do, so I'm going to save everything, I'm going to rebuild, and when it comes up, I'm going to run this and go to my store manager controllers index method to see if it does indeed show us our one album. So this will look just like our regular home page once it comes up. Again, I am producing the last thing that I created. You can see it's almost done, so this should speed up quite a bit after that. So we come over here, we go to the store manager. And as the author says, voila, we've got now a working app with real functionality and real data. We can look at the one album we have. We can edit it. Okay. We can show the details. Notice we don't have a URL set. We can even say we want to delete it. I'm not going to do that, but you can see it all works. And as the author mentions here, down toward the bottom of page 96, although it may seem like a lot of work, we spend most of the chapter going over the code that was automatically generated and also going over an introduction to the entity framework itself. All right? There wasn't a lot of code we had to write. After you know what scaffolding can do for you, the actual amount of work is relatively small. It requires the following 3 steps. Number 1, implement the model classes. Number 2, scaffold the controller and the views. Number 3, choose the database initialization strategy. And the author does talk a little bit about initializer seeds versus migration seeds on the top of page 97. It says, migrations also support seed methods, but there are differences between initializer seeds and migration seeds. Because the database initializer seed method runs against an empty database, you don't need to worry about inserting duplicate data. But with migration seeds, all right, they run every time you update the database, so you need to take care to prevent data duplication. All right, before we go on with the next section, which is editing an album, which we'll talk about momentarily. All right, because that will take up not all of the rest of the chapter, but most of the rest of the chapter. That and model binding will basically finish up this chapter. So I think I'll stop right here and pick it up in the next portion in just a couple minutes.